to Rock Island Line. I'm your host, Annika O'Melia, and today I'm joined by Jane Simonsen. Jane is a professor of history and gender studies at Augustana College and recently co-wrote and edited Call to Reckon, Replacing History and Reclaiming Mission at a Midwestern College, a book that explores Augustana's history within the broader historical context of the place it calls home. This is a wide-ranging conversation about what it means to acknowledge and reckon with history. We spend time talking about Black Hawk, the Sauk and Meskwaki, and how this land transformed in the early 1800s. We also discuss the Black Hawk sign, and Jane offers important insight into why it continues to spark controversy. Before we get started, a little housekeeping. This season, I'm aiming to release 1 to 2 episodes a month. Slowing the pace has given me more time to write at rockislandline.com, but I'd love your feedback, both on episode frequency and on guests you'd like to hear from. Lately, I've been focused on a few key local issues, including behavior concerns at Rock Island High School and a revolving loan awarded to an alderperson who had served on the loan commission until just weeks before receiving funding. I want to be honest for a moment. This work isn't always comfortable. Raising concerns about people in your own community, people you know, isn't easy. I've spent months trying to address some of these issues privately through emails and conversations behind the scenes. But what I've come to understand is this. Without public awareness and oversight, it's very difficult to create change in systems that are otherwise content to operate as they are. It's often easier to criticize people at a distance, national leaders, or individuals we don't know personally, than it is to speak honestly about what's happening in our own communities. We might feel comfortable calling out high school students for breaking rules in the hallway, but hesitate when elected officials appear to bend or ignore the rules of governance. And when that happens, we have to ask ourselves some hard questions. Are we holding everyone to the same standard, or are we, perhaps unintentionally, reinforcing a narrative where some people are labeled as rule breakers, while others are simply seen as being savvy or successful? A rule for thee, but not for me, is a pattern that can quietly take hold in public life. If we want fairness and accountability, it starts locally, with attention, with consistency, and with a willingness to speak, even when it's uncomfortable. I hear from people all the time who feel they can't speak up because of their jobs, their families, or the potential consequences. That hesitation is real. But what I'm talking about here isn't about attacking people or tearing anyone down. It's about acknowledging where things fall short and working to restore fairness as a community. There are things to reckon with in our community right now. And that's a fitting segue to today's conversation. So, without further ado, here's Jane Simonsen. So I'm here today with Jane Simonsen. And Jane, you've been a professor at Augustana College for the last 20 years, professor of history and gender studies. And I'm so excited to have you here today on the Rock Island Line. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's really exciting to be here. It's a great podcast.
Thank you. And before we started, you were saying that you are a podcast listener.
Yes.
And I was really interested in the podcast you're currently listening to. So, because podcasts can get heavy. You can be like, I go through phases with my podcast where I'm really into a topic or certain things I listen to. And then sometimes you need a break and you need something light. So what is it that you're currently on?
Well, I'll give a shout out to Petty Crimes, which is a hilarious podcast. It's Griff Stark-Ennis and Kira O'Sullivan, and she's a writer for SNL, and they started it before she started doing that. But people call in with ridiculous crimes, quote unquote crimes, things that happen at offices and, disputes with your neighbors, and they make it all very sweet and a little judgy, and it's a nice break from a lot of the heavy stuff that's going on right now.
Yeah,
so I enjoy that
cleanser.
One. Yeah,
because when you said crime, I imagined like murder, and then you were like, no, someone stole my sandwich in the refrigerator.
Exactly.
I
yes.
love that,
yes.
and it's called Petty Crimes.
It's called Petty Crimes. Yeah.
Okay, So after we talk, who knows how heavy it'll be, but someone might need to switch over too.
Yes, I haven't called in with a petty crime myself, but I've thought about it.
Yeah, and probably a lot of workplace stuff.
Yeah, workplace stuff, family stuff, neighbor stuff, who, steals the recipe at Thanksgiving, those kinds of
I
things.
love it.
But
I could see this in my house of who took my lip gloss between my daughters.
exactly. There was one about daughters stealing the mom's sweatshirt.
Oh,
And
that's a regular.
That was the crime.
We've given up on that. We're just like, our 7th grader steals all of our clothes all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I now have, all of my children are larger than I am, and I have taken their clothes now. So I have
Okay.
inherited some like pants and sweatshirts from my sons who are now much larger than I am.
Payback.
So I got some good stuff from them. Yeah.
So I usually start out with, where does your Rock Island journey begin? So how did you come to be, you don't live in Rock Island, but you work in Rock Island. How did you come to be a Rock Islander of sorts?
So I went to grad school at the University of Iowa, where I got my degree in American Studies. And my husband was there too. And after we finished, I got a job in Arkansas, in Conway, Arkansas, University of Central Arkansas. And we were there for 5 years, and it was good, but he never got a job, a permanent job, and we were far from family, so we decided to kind of go out on the market again. And I knew Augustana I went to Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota as an undergrad, and it's in the same network, so I knew of that. And one of my favorite professors had gone to Augustana, so I knew about it a little bit. I had an uncle who lived in Bettendorf, and so I remember driving through Rock Island in that area. And of course, when we lived in Iowa City, we came through the Quad Cities several times. So I kind of knew it. And I got the job, which was really exciting. And we had to look for a home pretty quickly because we had like 2 days that we came up from Arkansas to look for a house.
And this would have been in like 2003?
2006.
2006.
Yes, because we had an almost 2-year-old, and I was about 5 months pregnant. Wow. And so we were like, we need to find a house. And, with all the Quad Cities, we did some research kind of thinking about where are the different areas, what is walkable, how close are we to Augustana. My husband was thinking about going back to school at the University of Iowa. So we were thinking about tuition stuff and
the
commute. Yeah. So, and as 20 years ago, Blagojevich was the governor of Illinois and Vilsack was the governor of Iowa. And so we thought, let's bargain with Vilsack. And so we are on the Iowa side, but we are very close to the river. I can actually see Augustana from my window.
Oh, cool.
So we're 3.5 miles from work, so I can ride my bike to work. And so my connection to Rock Island is sort of, I don't feel like I'm that separate because it's right there outside my window.
Are you downtown, or are you in like the village of East Davenport?
We are kind of between the village of East Davenport and downtown.
Cool.
So
you don't need to tell us your address, but kind of
it's
in
between
zone
that, in that area there. And we loved the neighborhood. It's a very interesting neighborhood. It's got rentals, it's got big gorgeous houses in it, and it's got some parks. It's bikeable. So we kind of chose it for that. We were close to Lagamarchinos in the village of East Davenport. When you have kids, you're like, So yeah, and it worked out because I had small kids at the time. And so I used to be able to ride my bike, drop them off at the daycare at the YWCA at the old location, downtown Rock Island, and then continue on my way to work at Augustana. So
would you say that, moving to the Quad Cities with a young family, did the political environment or kind of the politics of the day shape, or was it a part of it all where you wanted to live? Because I could see for me that always being part of the equation, and so much has changed since 20 years ago. But was that part of, because you mentioned the governors, was that part of why you chose to live where you did?
It was, yeah. I mean, we were familiar with Iowa, right? Having gone to grad school at University of Iowa, so we knew Iowa City. It's a great town to be in, and we felt comfortable with the politics there. We were thinking about education too. I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin in the 70s, 80s, and Iowa was like known for its
Yes.
good education. And so was Wisconsin at the time. Like, this is a great place to go to school. And so those that did figure into our thinking. I knew Iowa better than Illinois was probably one reason, just having lived there for a while. And my mother's from Western Iowa.
And at 2006, so before Barack Obama got elected, but because we moved back to the Quad Cities in 2008 or 9 from Canada.
Okay.
And we lived in Iowa. So we lived in Bettendorf, and it was very, like, for me, I was like very tortured. I'm like, I have to live in Rock Island.
Yeah.
But we actually had a hard time buying a house in Rock Island. You know, we were a little bit priced out of the market, and we found this fixer-upper through a family friend in right by Rocket Park.
Oh, yeah.
But also around that time, you know, I would have said that Davenport, more progressive in some ways around education and same-sex marriage.
Yes.
And, you know, there were some hot topics going on 20 years ago. And so much has changed in the last 20 years. So now, if you were coming to the Quad Cities, you might think, oh, wait, the Illinois side. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah,
but...
no, I think it's true. I mean, even knowing some of the, you know, history of the Quad Cities, I mean, Iowa, even though it's never been like a super radical liberal state, I've always thought it is reasonable.
It had a moment, though, where it was kind of...
historically kind of on, not entirely, we could talk more about it, but like there are things that it has been very progressive on. Like I think about the campaign for the ERA in the late 70s and early 80s. So there was a coalition of people on both sides of the river trying to get the ERA passed. And Iowa was one of the first states, boom, to pass it. What is
the ERA?
The Equal Rights Amendment, sorry. Like talking like a history professor here. But yeah, just an amendment to the Constitution that has been, well, I don't know about the last couple of years, but has been proposed as an amendment basically every year since 1923. It just says that discrimination on the basis of sex is unconstitutional, and we have never passed it, right? And there was a big concerted effort to pass it in the late 70s and early 80s, and the Quad Cities was very active on both sides of the river, and there were a lot of marches, especially in Illinois, and the Iowa folks would come over because Iowa passed it almost immediately. I think it wasn't first, but it was one of the first, and it was mostly because of time zones, right? Like when the polls opened and things like that. But Iowa passed it. Illinois did not.
So what, because I don't know anything about this. I should, but so, because I think of like equal protection under the law or anti-discrimination laws. You can't discriminate against people based on sex or race or disability status. So what is different about the ERA than like what most of us might think of as just you can't discriminate against people?
Right. Well, and that's one reason why, especially in the last 20, 30 years, legislators have said, well, we don't need the ERA because there's all these other policies that keep people from discriminating on the basis of sex. For example, one of the big items of contention with the ERA, and interestingly, there were two Illinoisians who were very prominent on both sides. So Betty Friedan, who's from Peoria, who was pro Equal Rights Amendment, and then Phyllis Schlafly, who's from
St. Louis,
I think she was born in Alton. But yeah, from the region. Who was against
Betty Friedan
it.
was born in Peoria?
Yeah.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
That is.
She went to the same high school as my father-in-law.
Oh my gosh.
So it's all connected. But yeah, I mean, one of the big...
So we're really talking here about women's rights and feminism.
Yes.
And basically like the difference between a policy or a law and an amendment to the Constitution.
Right. So something like, I mean, one of the big issues in the late 70s and early 80s was bathrooms, right? The idea, could you have separate men's and women's bathrooms if the ERA was passed? I think most reasonable people would say, of course you can, right? But people were worried that, and it's kind of dredging up some of the same rhetoric that got used in the South and elsewhere with civil rights. Like, do you want Black people using your white daughter's bathroom. You know, the bathroom debates come up over and over again.
Bathrooms are really a place where we just can't. We're very sensitive.
We're very sensitive about bathrooms, right? So
okay, I heard this. Is this true? Like, because my mom is 70. Oh my God, she's gonna be mad at me if I make her the wrong age. 77, 76, 77. And so she grew up in Rock Island. So did my dad. They got married in 1969. Abortion was illegal. You know, it was just, and also though, when she wanted to get a checking account, she either needed, maybe it was a checking account or a credit card. She either needed like her dad or her husband to co-sign that that she could have that. Like without a man, you couldn't start to basically establish your own credit. Is all that true?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. I mean, there were all kinds of things that the ERA was pushing against that were more prominent at the time than they are now. I mean, because you could, for example, you could put out a job ad that said girl wanted to manage the front desk. Okay. Right. Which, you know, is discrimination of both kinds, because they're saying, oh, we don't want a man to be our secretary. You know, so, you know.
Is it also true that, like, around the bathroom thing, there was a time that if you were a woman and you were out in public, you were just going to have to hold it because there would be no bathroom for you. Yeah. So if you were going to run errands, or if you were even going to your job, it was possible that you worked in a building where you had no place to go to the bathroom as a woman. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is true in certain places. I mean, I know, for example, the college I went to, and Gustavus might contact me and be like, no, that's not true. But it was in the science building, they had to put in women's bathrooms because the science building, when it was built, I don't know, in the 1950s or something, there was one women's bathroom or something like that, because there were administrative assistants who needed to use it. But yeah, certainly in public life, and certainly before World War II, if you were a woman walking around in a downtown area, like there were certain places you couldn't go have lunch, you know, in a bar, or there just wasn't a safe place for you. I don't know that it would have been technically illegal, but it would not have been a comfortable place for a woman to be. There were not places to live. I was just reading, some students of mine are doing some research for a class I'm teaching now, and when more women started coming to Rock Island to get jobs during World War II at the Arsenal, there was a housing crisis for women because there weren't rental rooms that were available to women, because housing tended to be kind of segregated, right? So they would have, you know, there would be a rooming house for men, but not for women. So they were really like, oh, where are we going to put all these young single women?
Where'd they put them?
Live? I have to continue that research, right?
Because I know I
told my students, you got to solve this problem.
Yeah, so my husband's grandpa was a twin, and when he was in utero, his mom was pregnant with the twins and had another little kid, maybe just one, and her husband died of tuberculosis 3 weeks before the twins were born. So, and he was off in like a sanatorium or something and separated from the family, but they lived in Arsenal Courts. Okay. Because it was kind of government or low income housing, and she was a widow, and this would have been in the I don't even know when, 20s or I don't know when.
I think that's when that area was.
Or no, maybe that was built in 1930s.
Probably.
But whenever it was like first built, but it was segregated. So she lived there as a widow, but it was white only. Yeah. So, and there was this investment in public housing and this kind of recognizing the need for it. And those units were kept, I understand, in pretty good condition. They were built with like wonderful architectural, you know, integrity and all that stuff. And then I think over time, public housing became less cared for, less, and the government kind of got out of the business. But that's a whole other side quest. But but just the women being widows and kind of, I I don't know. It's so interesting. Gender studies and that's your whole world. Like you're just in this all the time.
Yeah, I usually get to be, which is pretty nice. Yeah, I teach both history classes, so U.S. history, history methods. I teach a class on Native American history, but then I also get to teach feminist theory, which is lots of fun, and the students are so energetic and so curious. And teaching feminist theory is usually something that the students haven't necessarily encountered or read, but when they read it and hear it, they're like, oh yeah, they kind of know it in some ways already. So those are fun classes to teach.
Yeah. So before we dive into some of your particular topics, getting back to kind of choosing, to come to Augustana and being part of a community, I'm just curious because you came from another place. What did you hear about Rock Island 20 years ago when you started to think about teaching here? What did you hear about us specifically in the landscape of the Quad Cities?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because when we started poking around and doing a little research on Rock Island, we thought, oh, actually, that looks like a great place. They had done some work on the downtown recently. I specifically remember that a movie theater had opened like a year or two before we moved here that served, you could get a beer in the theater. And
the Bruin View?
We were coming from a dry county and we're like, oh, wow, that sounds like a great place with, or you can go have watch a movie and have a beer. And we had small children, so we never did that actually. But yeah, we were sort of attracted to all the events that were going on too. And I mean, I guess to be honest, when we came up here, we really did think of it as the Quad Cities. We thought we were moving to a place that has a couple cities with different kinds of identities. And people were upfront about that, even when I came for my visit. Like kind of Davenport is where some of the arts are. That's where we have a theater and, those kinds of things. And Rock Island has the district and the students go there, and there are places where you can go and eat, and has kind of a blue collar work ethic. But I still remember this. It's not the only thing about Bettendorf, but somebody said Bettendorf is where the dentists are. And I thought that was very funny because my uncle, who was an oral surgeon, did live in Bettendorf, and our dentist still is in Bettendorf. But yeah, we just thought, okay, that sounds like a community that has all of the things, and has kind of different characters and different amenities and events going on. I mean, when we first moved here, we moved here at the beginning of the summer. So it was like Memorial Day, and all summer we were like, there's fireworks all the time in this community. There's always some event going on. And we were, close enough to the river, especially in the summer, that like Jamaica My Weekend, we could hear the music from our house, or the Quad City Pops, or the baseball games. So we were always like, there's always something that we could be doing here if we did not have small children at home. But museums. We took our kids to all the museums, especially, when they were real small, Putnam and places like that. So those are the things we heard. Like, we thought of it in a lot of ways as kind of a community that was connected. And that really has been for a long time my experience, especially because I do cross the river every day between home and work. But it's really only in the last 6 years that I've felt like there's a divide, right? And probably started with COVID, when Iowa and Illinois handled COVID differently, and then all of the sort of cascading political changes that have happened, especially in Iowa. And so I feel like they're a little more disconnected than they used to be, in terms of how people think of the communities, I guess.
Yeah, there have been more policy differentiation that would be noticeable in someone's day-to-day life.
Yes.
And maybe in your world, especially around women's health, So policies about reproductive health have diverged wildly. And that's really a development in my grown-up life too. And things with school choice and vouchers. And so lots of changes in education. You know, there's been a lot of changes. And so you have this kind of more stark contrast, not just in Iowa, but it's become more of a heavily red state. And Illinois is kind of becoming this heavily blue state. And, you know, that might change if you're on one side of the river or another. Access to health care, voting rights, you know, it really has shifted. But oddly, you think like, but it could go back in 20 years.
It could,
you know?
It could. And you know, it is odd because there's these different policies and laws on both sides, but like we're still all of us crossing the river, you know, for this race or this parade. Like there's still, or for work. And, you know, we're all going back and forth across the bridges all the time.
Yeah. The one that always gets me is we're a blue state. We're very union focused. We have really strong teachers unions. We have some of the best police and fire pensions of anyone in the country. I could be overstating that or getting my facts wrong.
We're the best.
You know, but so we're like, you know, if you're a police officer here, like you are going to be set for life. And for our local taxes, for our real estate tax, you know, that's where some of the taxes we pay go toward is paying police pensions, is taking care of our officers. And so sometimes people don't think about blue states as being like pro law enforcement. But we have these great benefits. And then you have very fiscal conservative people who are like, well, I'm going to live in Iowa because I don't want to pay these taxes. And it's like, but your taxes are going to take care of your union workers. So there's all these complicated things around identity and ideology and, you know, like I'm a Republican, so I don't want to pay taxes. But back the blue and take care of your officers. But don't make me pay the taxes, so I'm going to live in a different state. Or I'm going to retire and move to a state where I don't have to pay taxes. But people like to work in Illinois because you get these, but they don't want to pay taxes in Illinois.
It's funny. I mean, the way that public amenities and public service and public infrastructure has been politicized. Like things that are public are liberal somehow, and things that are private are conservative. But I mean, certainly, public servants, police, fire, protection, everybody is complaining about roads and infrastructure. Those are public. And our taxes pay for those. So I you know, everybody's complaining about potholes. We have a lot of potholes. We need to fix the streets, you know, but that takes taxpayer funds to do those kinds of things. And so, I think we forget how much we all rely on this pooled resources, right? I mean, that's what taxes are in the most general sense, is that if you're going to live in a community and benefit from that community, and some benefit more from that infrastructure than others because they rely on it for their, you know, shipping their stuff to and fro, right? And so, you know, the question about data centers and water goes into that, you know, who is paying for that? And you hear people saying, well, you know, those data centers should pay more for all that water that they're using. And so people are thinking about those things, but when it comes to politics, right, they're not considering always like, what does it mean to have public infrastructure? How do we all benefit from it? And I feel like those are places where people could and should be coming together across political divides. You know, the more local you are in like, what do I need in my community for my kids to have an education, for me to feel like somebody's going to show up if my house is burning, right? Those are things that everybody cares about. I hope.
And that there's been a kind of an idea that you shouldn't like paying taxes. You know, what's certain death and taxes, or I was having because it's tax time. So everyone's thinking about how can I reduce my tax bill? But there is another way to think about that, which is I don't mind paying taxes.
Yeah, it's a way to support a community.
I'm okay with it.
Yeah, there was, when we lived in Arkansas, there was, I'm trying to remember, it might have been Huckabee. It was governor when we lived there, and was joking about taxes, and people didn't want to pay them. And he started this little campaign called Tax Me More, which was supposed to be a joke. But people were they were like, where can I send my money for the Tax Me More campaign? Because I actually want better public amenities.
Wow. Maybe we need that here.
Yeah, maybe we do. The Tax Me More campaign. Yeah. I can't remember what year that was. We were there between about 2001 and 2006. So somewhere in that window.
Where you could opt in.
Yes.
Opt into, to doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, if you do charitable giving, right, that is a way of taking up the slack that's not being covered by taxes.
Yeah, but interesting. I was following a recent thing that came out of Forbes that looked at the wealthiest billionaires out there, and there are a couple. I think, the main rich guy from the longest ago, Warren Buffett.
Okay, the main rich guy.
Warren Buffett is very generous. I think Bill and Melinda Gates are pretty generous. But if you look at, Elon Musk and Sam Altman and Jeff Bezos and they are not that generous. Yeah. So they're only giving at a rate of about 3%. And also, there's some stuff going on now where you could make a ballroom a nonprofit. You could make, some charity that you like a nonprofit that is overseeing for-profit contractors. So this charitable giving, it seems like at the national level, has also gotten into being some sort of a pay-to-play strategy.
Yeah.
Let me donate to your thing, your nonprofit, as a way to show you that I have your back, and then you can approve my AI company or something.
Yeah. Well, and those private charitable giving is also a way for the wealthiest to call the shots, right? Because they get to decide, what quote unquote nonprofits they're giving to, as opposed to some, most people, kind of average middle class folks might say, hey, there is a need in my community for a safe place for unhoused people. I want to give, $100 or whatever to the third place. When you get to that highest level, when people have so much money, it really does direct the funds in ways that public, taxpayer money doesn't have to be beholden to the whims of the wealthiest, right? Yeah. Because it's everybody's money. It's going into this, people who deal with money in this city are like, it's not all the same pot, but basically you're paying the money. It goes into a fund that funds your schools, it funds your streets, it funds your public servants. And so privatizing giving, at the highest level, certainly, directs the money towards the things that the handful of people with the most care about.
Value, priority. Yeah, you kind of reflect then the values and priorities of those with the most.
Yeah.
There was some quote from Elon Musk that said it's just too hard to figure out how to give away money in the right way. It's too hard for him to figure out how to part with
all
that.
Of his help. I mean, we figure it out okay. It's just us.
But so we kind of got reconnected because the Black Hawk statue or sign, some controversy around that reemerged, which it has kind of over and over again throughout the years. And, I do this little Rock Island line thing. So if Rock Island specific things pop up, I often reshare them. And there's another kind of social media person named Royce Wright, who I really like. And I've gotten connected with him because he goes around to all sorts of buildings and is just like, what's up with this building? Why is it empty? And I just get such a kick out of him. He's got such a nice spirit about him.
Yeah.
And so one day in my feed, he's posing this question. What happened to the Black Hawk sign? Yeah. Where'd it go, you guys? Where is it? And I think KWQC did a story. Where is this sign? Mm-hmm. And I don't think the sign was really lost. I think people knew where it was from the time it was moved after a storm. But anyway, it kind of reignited this conversation around the Black Hawk sign.
Yeah.
And my initial I'm seeing this sign. I remember that sign. I remember driving down 11th Street. And I had feelings of like, I like that sign. Where did it go?
Yeah.
You know, it's really sad to see it laying in a kind of parking lot outside. It's always been outside, but so I just kind of put that out there. And then people are like commenting and some people, maybe you included, were like, you know, there's more to the story of that sign than just, here's a fun sign we all remember from childhood. So I went back and watched all the city council meetings and the controversy and the feelings. And I did this 20-minute video kind of taking little clips of that. But basically, this sign was part of Watchtower Plaza. It was paid for by kind of a for-profit entity that was trying to use the image of Black Hawk to promote commercial space. It was there since the 60s. And then back after the Walmart debacle, when everything was level, the sign still stood there. So it was almost like on this piece of land all by itself for years. And then in 2022, the president of Black Hawk Bank and Trust had approached the city and said, we would like to take the sign and take care of it. You donate it to us. We'll build a beautiful space for it to be. We'll put the money into kind of refurbishing it, and it can sit there as people are driving through to get their cash out of the ATM. It can sit there on our property in Milan. And I think this was just a personal conversation between a bank owner and a mayor to say, hey, we got a solution for you. It's just sitting there.
Right.
And the mayor said, okay. The council voted on it as surplus property, unanimously voted, go for it. Mm-hmm. So in a meeting, it was approved to be moved. And then the next meeting, there was some backlash because in all of that, I think my recollection is that there was no communication at all with any indigenous or native people, Meskwaki or the Sauk or Potawatomi, the Kickapoo. There was all these entities in the region, and no one was consulted. So at the next meeting, folks came back and said, how could you do this without even talking to anyone about this? And then it further was complicated because different people from different tribes had different viewpoints on what should happen with the sign. And then you were there kind of giving this perspective as a professor who teaches, you know, has knowledge and expertise in this field, talking about some of the research. And I was just fascinated by all of it. And then I started to think, ooh, maybe my initial like, I miss this sign. It's, you know, isn't very well thought out or reflective of the deeper history and meaning and what things mean to different people. And so that's how we got reconnected because,
and I think, I mean, the complexity, I think, is the important part, right? I just, and, you know, I'll disclaimers, I'm not a Native person, but, you know, I've long felt that it is my obligation as a white person who benefits from living here to know the history and kind of know the region and know how the Quad Cities came to be and things like that. And I mean, I should be honest that like part of what drew me to Augustana was the resources that we have in our special collections on Native groups in the area, especially the Meskwaki at Tama, because of John Henry Hauberg, who collected all this information. And I thought, wow, you know, this region has a really interesting and complicated relationship with its Native history. I think that these resources could be really interesting. And like I had small children at the time, so I was thinking about like what kind of research could I do close to home. And so I was really interested in the history of it. But yeah, the whole debate, you know, when I talked to the council again, I sort of said, I'm not a Native person, but here's the history that I know and that you should know. And even, you know, one way that I think this whole debate is so interesting and troubling and fascinating is that the image, the literal image of Black Hawk has been controversial and complicated from the very beginning, because he is somewhat unusual. And so the Black Hawk War happened in 1832, about 250 Sauk and Meskwaki people were killed, and you know some other folks that were with them. at the end of the war. And that's how the federal government acquired the land where Rock Island is now, because it had been signed in a controversial treaty. It had been in 1804.
That's what
had been signed over, and Black Hawk and other leaders disputed that. The Meskwaki disputed that because, it was one of those situations where the federal government had the wrong guys signing things under troubling auspices. And so for them, it wasn't necessarily a legal treaty, and still isn't to this day.
Well, it's kind of this idea to me of informed consent.
Correct.
If you're going into, if you're having somebody come to you and want you to sign documents and you don't, my assumption is at that time there were language barriers. There may have been written language barriers.
There were some. They always had translators, and I think there was a translator there because there's so many people of mixed heritage in the region too. Like, they could speak French, they could speak Meskwaki language, they could speak English, so they were there. But the misunderstanding in some ways was deeper. One, they didn't have the authority. They weren't there to do this. They weren't given the power to do this. They were probably given alcohol. So they, maybe weren't thinking in the ways that they should be thinking. But, moreover, when the federal government said, basically, you're signing this to us, but you can stay until we want it. And there are reasons for that, where people might say, oh, okay, we can continue to live where we're living. We can continue to grow things here and feed people, right? And so,
And were concepts of ownership the same?
No.
Because what I understand in my limited understanding is that back then people would have been like moving around the land. It was more temporarily. It wasn't like owned by an individual necessarily. You might have a territory.
Right. Well, they weren't. The Sauk and Meskwaki people, and most of the people who lived in this area, were not necessarily like nomadic in the way that we kind of get from the movies where people were on their horses. They had a village, and the village of Sauk and Meskwaki had, at times, thousands of people living there. So sometimes I talk to my students, and
I think 7,000 was like the highest number I ever.
Yeah, they were congregating there in part because of the pressures of white settlement, right? So different people from different tribal nations are kind of coming together because they're being pushed out and for protection. But yeah, there are villages all, if you look at old maps, all up and down the Mississippi. So sometimes students say, well, didn't the white people know there were Indians there? Like, of course they knew they were there. Like, some of them were married to them and had children. Like, they had been trading with them for a long time. But they, even going back, to basically 1400, there was this almost like a legal decree. I think the Pope originally made it, that said that if the land is not being used, then it can be taken. And at the time for the church, right? So like the Catholic Church, Christopher Columbus is kind of working basically for the Catholic Church, if the land is not being used. And so it's a very particular definition of use, right? And increasingly the idea of use is for profit, right? If you're not using the land for profit, then you're not really using it. So of course the people were using the land. They were growing corn there. The white settlers were buying corn from them even, but because they weren't kind of commercially engaged in their feeding their families, and there's some sacred properties of corn, like you're not actually using it. And so the idea behind this disputed treaty is like, when the U.S. government decides that it wants this land, it can come. And so they did, like, people like literally showed up and moved into the houses of the people that were living in Sauk and Meskwaki, because they had gone, so they had homes, but, you would move to go hunt where the deer were, right, in the other game, just like people do now, right?
Some transition between seasons,
right.
But it wasn't like really super far away. It might have been in Clinton, Iowa.
Exactly.
Or,
so
yeah.
you would go, now people might go up to northern Wisconsin and go hunting, right? Because that's where you can get the stuff. So, let's go, for the winter season, we're going to go hunt.
Yeah, my in-laws' house is empty right now because they go to Florida for the winter. So
Right.
I could just move right in.
Exactly. And so, if you're a white settler, like, oh, this house is vacant, let's move in. And they get back and they're like, what are you doing here? And they're, oh, you signed this treaty. And a lot of it had to do with war, right? The War of 1812, like once the War of 1812, interestingly lasted till about 1816, but that was against Britain. And a lot of people were like, why are we fighting Britain? We thought we took care of that in the Revolutionary War. But there were still a lot of British folks in the area and native people who had allied with the British. And so a lot of that war was to kind of...
And did the Meskwaki and the Sauk join the British forces in the War of 1812?
Interestingly, they were divided. So Black Hawk and some of the folks that resisted with him in 1832 were sometimes called the British Band because they had allied with Great Britain, because they had trade relationships with British traders. And to their understanding, the British weren't necessarily trying to take over the land. They just wanted to trade with them. That's a different kind of relationship than like, we're going to build our houses here. And they knew that the Americans were building houses. And even a little bit south of here, if you look at old maps, there's a line, a tract of land that was called bounty lands. So the bounty lands from the War of 1812 were used to, they were payment for soldiers who had served in the War of 1812, kind of like a pension would be today. And so the idea was, well, we're kind of expanding into hostile territory in some ways, right? Where people are living who don't want us to take over the land. So wouldn't it be great if we got a whole bunch of veterans to settle there and kind of help hold that land against Native people who at the time were more allied than they had been, say, 100 years before. It was kind of a pan-Indian movement, if we could call it that, where people were sort of across different tribal nations were allying with each other to try to say, okay, we got to stem the tide of the white folks. So, the group of people who kind of moved with Black Hawk were often called the British Band. And the Sauk and Meskwaki are different tribal nations, right? And they allied much earlier, again, kind of a defensive move, so that they could have more protection from encroachment from whites. And really, I don't know, that period of history is so fascinating because Native nations were much more powerful agents than people realize, really until the end of the War of 1812. Like the Iroquois Confederacy was huge, right? And very powerful. I sometimes still have trouble convincing my students, who I think now are often learn in high school, and not without reason, that white people came and destroyed all the Indians and destroyed everything that they had and took all of their land, and they were weak and helpless. Like that's a very simplified story of what that period of, basically from 1600 to 1812 was really like.
My daughter is in AP U.S. History. Yay. And I think that's the hardest class at Rock Island High School. They say, of all the classes, A-Push is very challenging. And they have been learning about the Trail of Tears, which is south of, and who was the president at the time? Jackson. Yeah. So there were all these legal documents and can you, because I will botch it to the nth degree, but these nations had thoughtfully and strategically crafted and put together, agreements, and that this had it gone to a Supreme Court of sorts, and everything was decided upon. And Jackson was this figure who basically said, make me follow the law. Like, so he basically acted illegally was he the president at the time?
Yeah.
Basically, he's the president, and all the courts and everything is like, you can't do this. And he was like, stop me.
Yeah.
And marched people off their land at gunpoint.
Yeah.
And people died on this, but basically was like, and where was this? Was this in Louisiana?
So
or?
Georgia. Yeah. So the Cherokee removal, and the Cherokee were a very powerful tribal nation, right? And had very diplomatic relationships with the U.S. They had, one of the things they were really well known for was having their own written language much earlier than other tribal nations did. And they had their own newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix. So a lot of the cool primary sources that probably your daughter and others can look at are things that were published in the Cherokee Phoenix. And their leader, John Ross, his name was John Ross. He had a Cherokee name as well. But very educated, literate property owners. And, one of the controversies is that some members of the Cherokee Nation did own slaves. Some intermarried with African-American people. And they've recently said, yes, people of African descent can also be members of this tribal nation. But yeah, it was really a kind of, I am overturning the long history of diplomatic relations with tribal nations as independent nations making treaties, right? That's what nations do. When you make a treaty, you're making it with another nation. And, if you ever hear these like states' rights things, they're like, the state of Georgia now gets to decide if they want this to remove people from the state. And it was all about land, and it was all about economics, right? So one of the reasons that if people know Jackson, right, they're like, well, yeah, he was the guy who did the Indian removal, but it was all about the national debt, right? Because he, it's 1804, right, in the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. now owns this land that has a lot of native people living on it. But Jackson, there's this, too complicated, your daughter would know about this, but there's a bank crisis that goes on, and like there's a lot of debt. And so Jackson's like, well, we could just start selling off those public lands. And they're called public lands because the U.S. owns them, but they have not been kind of subdivided for private ownership yet. So, this whole area kind of gets developed in that way with public land sales, where people are buying, $1.25 an acre to buy land. And so those removals, a lot of people learn about the Cherokee removal, but the Black Hawk War was
the same thing.
It was a war of removal.
Yeah.
And Black Hawk and some other leaders, his son, were captured. They turned themselves in
well,
some ways.
Hadn't they left? They had left because they were under force or kind of told you have to leave, but then they had kind of regrouped and said, we need to go back and take back our land. Basically, like, this isn't right. These treaties were signed under, not the right people signed them. None of this is good. So we're going to go back and take our land or reassert ourselves here.
Yeah. And
that is the Black Hawk War, basically.
Yeah. And so they come back and the Illinois gets up a militia of people, basically white people who lived here. So they were not members of the army, right? They weren't officially members of the army. They're people
living in this guy's house.
The people who are here, who want to stay here, and they kind of organize as a militia, sign up, and they start kind of pursuing Black Hawk and his followers. So 250.
And this would have been
people.
In like
1832.
Because I had Rob McCoy on, who is Two Rivers, and he was kind of talking about the, foundation of that church and how it was founded in, it might be 1810, it might be 1832, I'm not sure. Yeah. But we were kind of like, oh gosh, like what was, this church that's getting founded there that is this long-standing historic church in Rock Island, and like those may have been the militia of,
Yeah, because I mean, Rock Island
Maybe not, but
it was, I think, founded in like 1836. Davenport was, but yeah, people were living here, right? White people were living kind of scattered around the area, but the removal from the Black Hawk War is really what allowed these towns to flourish.
yeah.
There was this resistance, and they, kind of go up the Rock River, go through southern Wisconsin. And, growing up in Wisconsin, I never learned this either. This all this happened, but they end up at the Mississippi River, Black Hawk and his folks. And they, there were white folks that were killed, right? They did resist against it. But a lot of them were women and children that were with them too. Like, it was just the whole group of people moving along. They get to the Mississippi River.
At what point, do you know?
Bad Axe.
Battle of Bad Axe.
Battle of Bad Axe. If you drive, I was just a couple weeks ago driving along the river from La Crosse back here, and there's the monument, right, of the Battle of Bad Axe. And so on a beautiful spot of the river, with all these kind of backwater areas, but they are there, and there is a steamboat called the Warrior that is filled with, by now the army has arrived, like the organized army has been sent from New York, and they're on this boat, and the people are like, okay, we're going to go to Iowa, we're going to cross the river. They start crossing the river, and they start shooting them in the water.
Yeah. Children.
With children.
Women.
Yep. Like, there are people who survived as babies who were like, my mother swam me across the river to escape. And they didn't want to go, in part because the Dakota were there, the Sioux people, and they're the enemies. So they were being also pushed from one kind of enemy territory to another at the time, because people still today, just lump like Indians all in one group, but they have long, complicated histories, even even within like bands of the same tribal nation. You talk to somebody, they're like, they're from the Bear Clan, we don't get along with them very well. I mean, they're kind of kidding.
I mean, within a family, you could be like, absolutely. We don't talk to the,
we're different than they are.
Yeah.
But yeah, Black Hawk was turned himself in, basically.
So he was leading people across that river,
right? And I should check on. I don't know that he was physically there at that point.
And this is not in Rock Island. This is north. This is
in Wisconsin.
In Wisconsin. Yep. But were people trying to go down to get back to the Rock Island area?
They were trying to just get away. And so they thought, well, if we cross the river into Iowa, where they told us to go, we'll be safe.
Okay.
Right. So they're literally fleeing and going where they were told to go. Because there were some of the Sauk had stayed over there, like Keokuk's band was there. Right. So again, they're kind of different bands. So they thought, well, we'll go back over there. They did have villages, and the Meskwaki had villages over there. So they were trying to escape. To think about the image of Black Hawk.
So had they ever made it back to our area to fight, or they were en route to try to get back and all of this fighting happened?
They didn't get back, although they were, those who survived were rounded up and brought to Fort Armstrong. So on what's now Arsenal Island. And then this is a whole horrible part of the whole thing too, is the troops that came from New York got cholera. They brought cholera with them, and they are dying on the way. Wow. Because they're all on a ship together. And so that's another tragedy. It's like these young men who are like 20, white guys who are, called up to fight this war, die too, because they get cholera. So cholera got to Fort Armstrong, right, with these army guys. They send the native people to Fort Armstrong basically as prisoners, and then some of them get cholera and die too. So the treaty that ended the Black Hawk War was actually signed on the Iowa side, not at Fort Armstrong, because nobody was supposed to go on the island because everybody there had cholera.
Jeez.
Yeah.
And Black Hawk ends up signing a treaty of sorts.
Yep.
And so he resists and fights and tries to, but then is put in a position to be a person. Because one thing I found really fascinating about when I started reading about this was that you said often it's a character who became a transition point in their own pushing out, or I don't know, there's probably a better word for that, but in their own colonization to some extent, that becomes this like worshipped figure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, Black Hawk. So, and I should have checked on this. I'm not sure if he actually got to sign that treaty. I don't know if they let him. Keokuk, I think they said, you sign it. So, and they had kind of a, I don't know, probably a complicated relationship with one another. But yeah, we tend to, I would say, romanticize some of these figures like Black Hawk as kind of representatives that we can call out and say, and I don't know, this is my opinion, to sort of say in a kind of nostalgic way. So we can say, oh, it's too bad this happened to poor Black Hawk, right, and his people. And we respect him, as a figure who fought for his people. So we tend to kind of identify with him as a person who loved the same place that we love. And I think that's where, when I think about the sign, and I was just telling you that my husband was like, well, you have to have some sympathy for the people who have nostalgia for this sign. I'm like, I do, because we do tend to, if you love Rock Island and you say Black Hawk loved it too, we share the love for this place, for this river, for the island, for the landscape. And so they become this kind of connecting point for us, but also conveniently gone, right? And in some ways not really fully human, I guess. And that happened to Black Hawk so soon. Like, his image was all over the place. Like, he went out east after the war. That was something that the government often did to try to show leaders, like, look how many white people there are. You'll never resist us. His son came with him, and apparently his son was a very attractive man. And so women would come and be like, ooh, Black Hawk's son, he's hot. And, and that's sort of weird too, where he's sort of, they were like celebrities. Paraded around. Yeah. And so his image, Black Hawk, by my count, and there may be more, like there's drawings of him too, but he had his portrait painted at least 12 times in the span of years following the Black Hawk War until he died in 1837. And so, like, the one that we see most, where and that is kind of the basis, I think, for the sign, where he's wearing, he has like a red roach. It's the one that's on the Black Hawk Bank and Trust sign. He's wearing a white shirt. I don't know how often people notice that the shirt that he's wearing is kind of what's the right word? Almost like a cosmopolitan shirt. Like it's a shirt that would have been worn by somebody who kind of moves between cultures, right? I think it's even called like a trade shirt. So it's a white cotton shirt. Sometimes people wore it for hunting and things like that, but it's not of indigenous origin. So he's already in that portrait, which was made in 1837 by Charles Bird King, presenting himself as a complicated person, right? Who is wearing his roach. And so that would made, it's like animal hair, and it's attached to a scalp lock. So his head is sort of plucked, shaved on the sides, and then they would leave a little bit of hair, and then you attach the roach to it. So he's wearing that. So he's wearing kind of his formal clothing in some way, but he's posing for a portrait, right? An official portrait. He still thinks of himself as a diplomat, right? Moving between cultures in that portrait.
Yeah, and part of the problem with the sign is it's a caricature, an inaccurate caricature of a human.
Right.
That sends messages about a group of humans. They're all caricatures. And so that sign, while a kid like me growing up is like, oh, that's a cool sign. In watching back those videos, hearing from, native populations that would come here to do powwows before there was like a parking lot put in and that ended, but hearing people say that was actually painful for them, that when they would come back to or lived here or would come back and travel to Rock Island and see that giant statue, portrait, or sign, that it would actually make them feel sick. Yeah. That this is not a legacy that is representative or reflective of the complexity, of the dynamics, of the humanity of everything.
Yeah.
That it was hurtful.
Yeah. And I think there's so many cool images of Black Hawk that show him as a complicated person. Like in every image, he looks a little bit different. Like all the famous guys painted him. George Catlin, who even if you've never heard his name, you've seen paintings by George Catlin, painted lots of native folks kind of between the 1830s and 1840s. So Catlin painted him. And one of the things that I thought is really fascinating is when we see images of Black Hawk, because he had his portrait made multiple times, people who are representing him get to choose which version of Black Hawk they want to represent. So some people may know he wrote in translation an autobiography, or he spoke his autobiography, and you can still get it. It's, been around for a long time. It's a good read. People should read that if you want to talk about the Black Hawks. It's called The Autobiography of Black Hawk.
Oh, okay.
Or I should have written down his name, his native name, The Black Hawk. So it was written shortly after the war. He dictated it to Antoine Leclerc, who translated it to a guy named J.B. Patterson, who published a newspaper in the area and then published it. And, there's some controversy about how much did the translation and the publication in English take liberties with his account. But he's pretty bold in the account. He's not varnishing anything. And the Sauk people have subsequently used it for legal claims to the land, so they take it pretty seriously. So when he published his autobiography the first time, there is a picture of him on the flyleaf of the first page, and he's wearing a suit. And I'm like, interesting, we choose not to represent him wearing a suit.
I mean, so I'm Swedish, and my family is like, Eriksson Hall is one of my relatives.
Oh, wow.
But, we do, when I was little, we did the maypole where you get in your traditional outfits and you dance around a maypole, or for the holidays, you do, you put crowns on your head with candles, and you wear a white outfit with a red sash, and but that's not like what a Swedish person would be wearing around in their day-to-day life, but it might be a ceremonial or a ritual or so it would be, it would be that, like, and I heard the blue robe was wrong on that statue, like the outfit wasn't even correct, but you'd be capturing someone in a ceremonial part of a culture or something.
Right, yeah.
But you would miss out on the complexity of the human being.
I mean, even today, Indigenous people wear regalia for particular occasions, right? And they might wear it to a powwow, or there might be other occasions where you wear your regalia. You don't wear it all the time. And like when he had his portrait painted, he probably had some power to represent himself the way he wanted to, and maybe not completely. So even that Charles Bird King one, that's the basis of so many of the images that we see, he's wearing this red blanket. That red blanket is in a ton of portraits that Charles Bird King
he's
painted.
Like, put on the red blanket.
Right. So you're like, well, okay, here's the blanket that you wear, for these pictures, or it could have been a lot of people had a red blanket. But so, most portraits even today are like a partnership between the person sitting for the portrait and the person being represented. But he's wearing a suit in several portraits. He was probably given the suit as a gift by representatives from the federal government. So some historians say he was forced to wear the suit. I don't think he probably was in at least all the portraits, because he seems like a guy who picks what he wants to wear. Even afterwards, when he wasn't at a formal occasion, like neighbors that saw him in Iowa were like, oh, Black Hawk wore that suit.
So where did he live after all of this?
He lived...
Because he was captured and imprisoned for some amount of time, and then the groups are kind of said maybe he doesn't sign it, but it's like, okay, now we're really, you're going to sign over the land and this is over now. Like, don't try to resist and you can be free, and tell your people not to resist and you can be free. And so then where does he go?
He ends up back in Iowa, and he's sort of kind of a little bit disempowered, right? So Keokuk is empowered to be the kind of spokesperson for the tribal nation. But yeah, he lived down kind of near Keokuk for the last couple years of his life. It sounds like he kind of stayed in the same area,
but never came back to Rock Island.
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
He may have, I mean, certainly other people did. Like if you read old documents, because a lot of the Sauk and Meskwaki people and others too, like Kickapoo, Menominee, would come to Fort Armstrong to get their annuity payments. So when you sign a treaty agreement and relinquish land to the federal government, you did get something in return. It wasn't a lot, but it was annuities. And so the federal government would kind of designate leaders that they would pay these annuities to, that were then supposed to disperse them to the people. But they'd come here and pick them up, right, and hang out for a while. If you read old, they're called old settler accounts. So especially John Henry Hauberg interviewed a lot of people who had come here in the 1840s, and white people. And even in the 1840s and 1850s, so they're kind of recollecting their childhoods. They're like, oh yeah, and there was, they call him like Indian Bob, would come by sometimes and, smoke a pipe with my dad. Or, So clearly, we sort of have this idea that after the Black Hawk War, everybody was gone, but they weren't. And, women especially, there were some women who had like French or British fathers and Sauk or Meskwaki mothers who were in this area for decades.
Yeah.
Married white men. Antoine Leclerc was Potawatomi and his wife was Meskwaki. They both had mixed parentage. Like people like say, well, all the native people went away. I'm like, no, Anton Leclerc was here till he died, and he was one of the richest guys in town.
And he founded Davenport or something, right? He's I don't know if you found something, but.
No, it was because he was Potawatomi. That's how he got the land. So his mother was Potawatomi, and his wife is Meskwaki. And so in, I should have checked which treaty it was. I think it was the treaty that ends the Black Hawk War. Written into the treaty is, and we give 640 acres to Antoine Leclerc. And so, like, even in Moline, there's a Leclerc's reserve that was given to him even before the Black Hawk War. So this was not uncommon that when Native nations signed treaties, they would sometimes ask that people of mixed parentage be provided for, because especially if their father wasn't Native, they might not always be, completely of the tribal nation. And so you have even pockets of land in Illinois that are reserves that are given to specific people in the treaties. And so that's how that chunk of Davenport got to Leclerc.
What chunk is it? What chunk do you know? Where?
Yeah, it's so kind of from about mid downtown Davenport. I guess towards the west, like downtown Davenport, almost to where his home, like past where his home is on the east side. I should have checked exactly, but it's 600
a lot of land,
40 acres. I think it was a big chunk of land,
and the basis of the city that we know today.
Right, and so he was an entrepreneur. And he really controlled the land market, right? Because he could sell off some of these portions of land to people, to investors, and that's part of how Davenport got built up. And then Rock Island, on the other side, part of how it got built up is because George Davenport was a trader, and he was the person to whom the Sauk were most in debt when they signed the treaty, right? So they were in debt from trade relations, and George Davenport, and he had two partners, trade partners, and so they were something like $40,000 in debt to him. So as part of the treaty, the federal government said, well, we'll pay off your debt. And by the time that actually all got worked out, George Davenport's two trade partners had died, and he got it all.
Wow.
Right. So
died under mysterious circumstances?
And then later he dies under mysterious circumstances, and that's a whole nother story that has to do with like Mormons and all kinds of
interesting.
It's a wild story too. But yeah, so he makes money and then invests in land. So he bought up a lot of the public lands in what's now Rock Island. So, like Black Hawk State Historic Site, for example, was their land for a while.
That Davenport bought.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Hauberg estate, that family bought the land from Davenport.
Right.
And it was 10 acres, and Susan Dankman bought it from the Davenport's daughters or something like that. Davenport's daughters.
I always mix up Lincoln Park and Longview Park, the one with the swimming pool.
That's Longview.
Yeah,
yes.
Longview.
Yes.
That was their land. So Bailey Davenport, one of his sons, and was the mayor of Rock Island several times, I think 4 times. Mm-hmm. He hung on to that land for a long time, such that Rock Islanders started getting a little annoyed because they were trying to build up the town, and they're like, he's just hanging on to this. It was called Bailey's pasture, this giant chunk of land. And because he liked horses, and he ran horses on that land, but they wanted him to sell it off. But the Davenports, they were bankers and investors and all of that, it's part of the aftermath of the Black Hawk War.
Wow.
Yeah.
And at the same time, because you have a book about kind of everything that's going on in this time period with the Sauk and Meskwaki and all the different, nations. And then also here comes Augustana College, which is taking root and having its foundation in Rock Island. And so you have this book called A Reckoning?
It's called, actually,
To Reckon?
I edited it, so
Okay.
It's written by a bunch of us, from a couple people, faculty.
I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to.
That's okay. And you can read it in chunks for
Okay.
anybody out there. It's called Call to Reckon.
Call to Reckon.
Yep. Replacing History and Reclaiming Mission at a Midwestern College. That's the whole title.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really about reckoning with Augustana's history. It was funded by a grant from, it's called NetView, the Network for Vocation and Undergraduate Education. So those of us who worked on it, a couple administrators at Augustana, some faculty, a couple of graduates worked on it as well. And so the grant allowed us to, have a summer stipend. We got together and kind of talked about our plans and had some meals together and did research that is designed to, the grant we got was called Reframing the Institutional Saga. So thinking about how institutions of higher learning talk about their histories and who they are. And this grant was to say, let's look again at that history and who we are and what all that means. So it was a really interesting project for me to work on. I was able to write a chapter on my own about the history of the place where Augustana is now located. And then I collaborated on 2 others, the introduction, which I co-wrote with Harrison Phyllis, who at the time that we were writing it was the assistant special collections librarian at Augustana and is a graduate. And then I collaborated on another chapter on African-American students at Augustana with my former colleague, Lauren Hammond Ford, who has since moved on to a more administrative position out in Colorado. But yeah, really fun to go digging through the archives for the voices of people who are not often included in institutional histories, which are often kind of what were presidents doing, what kind of decisions did administrators make, but we wanted to know more about the student experience.
And what year was Augustana founded?
It was founded in 1860 in Chicago, but it moved to Rock Island in 1876. I think that's right.
Okay.
Kai Swanson's probably going to call me on my phone right now and say, "Wow, it was 1874." But they came here. They were briefly in Illinois, kind of out in the country, in part because they wanted, again, a complicated history. They wanted to move away from Chicago. There were some political and religious reasons that they wanted to move out of Chicago, and then bought a chunk of land here from a banker named Hull in 1870s. There were Swedes, in Moline, and so that was one of the reasons that they built here. But it was also, it was an up and coming city, but still had reasonable land prices. But yeah, it was founded right before the Civil War broke out, which is sort of interesting. And so that was a bit of a crisis too. The Swedish immigrants still thought of themselves as Swedes, right? And so they distanced themselves a little bit from Civil War and all that meant.
I think one of my ancestors immigrated from Sweden at the time of the Civil War.
Okay.
And was paid to go to war for someone who was kind of
bought themselves out.
And then the wife and the children were supposed to get some land and some payment, and then my ancestor ended up dying, and then that they never got what they were supposed to get.
Oh man.
And then they ended up in the Chicago fire, and then the woman and her children, and then I think one of, oh my gosh, Kai might be upset with you. My mom gave me a binder of my history that my sister and I recorded a podcast where we tried to recount our history.
Oh, wow.
But we botched it so bad I never put the podcast out because my mom's like, you need to study your binder before you. And I still can't remember
that history. Yeah.
But I do know that some of the people that I'm related to ended up here because of Augustana.
Right.
So one of my great grandpas was speaking Swedish in Chicago, and someone was like, "Oh, you speak Swedish? Do you want to come be a teacher at Augustana?" Another one of my ancestors had a 5th grade education and ended up coming and working at Augustana and being very high up. And maybe I don't know who it is though. I need to research this more. My sister and I will talk about it. But I do know that for my family, Augustana and being Swedish is why we all ended up here.
Wow. That, in some ways that doesn't surprise me because, part of the reason the school was founded was to educate the children of, first Swedish immigrants and then the children of Swedish immigrants. At first was for people who wanted to go into the ministry, right? That was kind of the initial founding. But it's always been kind of interestingly, and my colleague Mark Safstrom wrote a chapter on this, really not necessarily designed to be an elite institution, right? That it was designed for children of immigrants, right? To find useful work in the world in both the sense of, making money and surviving, but also fulfilling vocation. So I think, that was one of the things that was really interesting about the book is that I think we're both critical of the places where the institution has not fulfilled its mission. But for me anyway, it was eye-opening to learn about the ways that the institution has had kind of a really cool mission for a long time in being a place where immigrants and then others could really find a place, right? And so the fact that your ancestors saw the Rock Island, Moline area, and even Augustana as a place where you could, my colleague Mark Safstrom used the term bilocate, right? You can be both Swedish and of America. And Augustana was more open earlier to people who didn't speak Swedish than some of the other Swedish institutions. So I found out that my alma mater, Gustavus, actually, Augustana hired a guy who had been teaching at Gustavus, but he was born in the US and he didn't speak Swedish. And he wasn't yet Lutheran. He was willing to convert to Lutheranism, but there wasn't in St. Peter, Minnesota, any Lutheran church that was in English. But then Augustana hired him, and then he helped to found an English-speaking he converted and then helped to found an English-speaking Lutheran church in Moline.
Oh.
And he's interesting.
Which church was that? Do you know?
Trinity Lutheran?
I mean, I went there for a little while.
I should have brought my copy of the book. I wasn't sure if we were going to go there or not.
St. John's,
but...
and then when I was a teen, we moved over to Trinity Lutheran. That's
well,
where a lot of the
that's right. Then
Swedes
it was
were.
Andrew Woods Williamson was one of the founders, and he, speaking of Indigenous history, is super interesting because his parents were missionaries to the Dakota.
Oh.
In the 1830s up in Minnesota, and not all of the folks his parents were working with, but he grew up speaking Dakota.
Well, I don't know if this is even true, but my mom is 100% Swedish, and her family all kind of comes from central Sweden. So my dad is 50% Swedish. His dad is like a bunch of different things, because now you can do ancestry DNA and all that stuff. Well, my dad's mother, Helen, her mom came here from Sweden. So my great grandma Gandhi, and my grandma, but she was an interesting woman. She was a storyteller, but she told us that her ancestors are Sami, which is indigenous to Sweden and Norway and Finland, and then it's weird because like my ancestry DNA, I don't feel like bears that out, because you can kind of see regions, because usually that's tied to more like Finnish descent. But then my sister and I both went to the Mayo Clinic, and they did our DNA, and it was showing a bunch more of Finnish descent, whereas ancestry DNA did not.
Interesting.
So it's really interesting, and but the thing that I find most interesting about it is my little sister is a singer, and so if you research Sami culture, they kind of had a faith of like animism, but their really powerful leaders were in part females who used their voice, and they channeled vocal. So there's something called yoiking. And
I've heard of this. Yes.
And my sister, if you listen to her music, I mean, that's what she's doing.
Oh, wow.
In a lot of her vocalization. And so I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know how one would ever find that out. But my grandma insisted that our family was in part stemmed from indigenous culture in Sweden.
In Sweden, yeah. Oh, that's super interesting.
And when we smile, all our eyes close, and that is part of. But a lot of people do, But it's like,
I don't know, my Danish and Irish eyes, don't squeeze shut too much.
And what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean to be from a people?
Yeah.
How do you hold on to that? Does it mean, I don't know. It's so
knowing the culture.
Yeah. And what is it? Because to reckon is a verb, I'm going to reckon with something. Like, what are we supposed to do with that? I mean, I have these different sides of my family that have different histories and different perspectives on race, perspectives on culture, perspectives on, it's just within your own family system, you could have stuff to reckon with.
Yeah.
In your own past, you could have, in the short span of my own life, I have things that I reckon with. So, are we supposed to reckon? Are we?
That's a great question. That's sort of, where we kind of, I don't know that we solve any problems with this book, in that I think a lot of us thought of it as opening up a door to a conversation, to think about knowing this history. How do we kind of move forward from some of the mistakes, and then how do we use some of the usable parts of our past to think about pathways forward. So like if Augustana has long been an immigrant institution, like if it was literally founded to help people who maybe didn't speak the language, didn't know the culture, but were interested and wanting to be connected to a place, what does that tell us in terms of our responsibility now to immigrants or to our many international students? Or if we know that how the land where the college stands did come to us, as everywhere in the United States basically comes to settler hands through the same kind of mechanism, right? How can we learn more about a place to have better connections? I don't even want to use a loaded term like authentic connections, but like healthier connections to a place. Like if the ways that a lot of indigenous people use the land was not necessarily for profit, but to feed the people who live there, and even in their spiritual practices, if they respected the plants around them for their healing powers and their health benefits, and the animals around them as almost like nations in their own right, like what let's remember that part of our history too, because that could be very useful to us now, is to think about, what literally are more sustainable relationships with land.
Yeah.
Or if we know that, as my colleague Lauren Hammond Ford and I discovered, thinking about the long history of, basically since the early 20th century, we've had Black students at Augustana, and they did not feel welcome, right? And some of them still don't. Like, so you can open your doors to a people and say, come on in and, enjoy being in the classroom, but does that mean that you're willing to kind of change some of the things that you do in order to make them feel like they are also of that place?
Yeah.
And that's something we've worked on much more in the last 10 years since we hired our first director of diversity. So that was Dr. Monica Smith, who has since moved on to another position. And we now have the Culture and Connections, which is run by Gauri Patel. And so I think we have worked on kind of like, how does the institution incorporate all these different cultures and histories into the things that we do every day? But that's a long process.
I feel like we are still grappling with what we grappled with at the time of Black Hawk, and can different people live together, not only in proximity to one another, but in fellowship?
Yep.
Like, does that experiment work? And that's what America is.
Yeah.
I mean, we are uniquely, I liked Barack Obama. It might come as a shock to some of the listeners, but I feel like one of the most hopeful, wonderful things about his entire message and candidacy and all of that was, like, we could all live in a Bad Bunny Super Bowl ad halftime show. Like, we could just be together and have fun and not only have proximity to one another, but fellowship and love each other. And, like the human body needs diversity within it to fight off bacteria. Any ecological system needs diversity to strengthen itself. A coral reef, a field, sameness means death in some ways. That, if a system doesn't evolve and change and diversify, even a biological system, it's not healthy. And so, but I still think we have not freaking figured out this puzzle in this country or in the broader world of how do people with different backgrounds, how do we be together? Yeah. And it's so dumb. It's like, why have we been grappling with the same issue that we did at the time of settlement as we are today?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think the best, I've had friends, we've talked about this, like the best examples of that, like kids who play sports or who are on a team or some manufactured situation where by virtue of what you're doing, you have to be integrated in a way.
Right. But you're still playing the role that you're really good at in most
But
teams.
you also come to love people. Like you're not just in you're not just like next to them, like living life next to you. It's like, oh, now we're in a situation where because we're together in a way that is intimate and familiar, and we're staying the night at each other's houses, and we're going through ups and downs together where we love each other. We want to be together, and you have to have like systems that bridge that.
Yeah.
So it's not just proximity, it's intimacy. And obviously people find that the families were being formed at the time of colonization, where people were falling in love and blending their families and
sustaining their culture, but still being part of something blended, right? And I think a number of...
But do all cultures fear blending? Do all cultures fear erasure? Do all cultures fear... like, I love my Swedish identity, but I don't feel that it's under siege or that someone could take it from me. Like, I don't ever feel threatened that, like, oh no, someone's going to take away my Swedish identity because I hold it.
Yeah.
And it's...
Some people do, though, I think, feel threatened by that, unfortunately. Or like, I mean, you can think maybe in terms of religious identity too. Like, if people have a certain religious identity, you wouldn't want that taken from you. That, if you're Catholic, you would want to feel free to be Catholic, but it's fine to have Protestant friends, right? Or I grew up in a mixed religion marriage. So my parents got married in 1963. Is that right? Yeah. And my mother was Catholic, my father was Methodist, and his father was a minister. And so, like, when when they met, they were like, oh, we can't ever get married. And they literally were together for 7 years.
Oh my goodness.
Before they were like, whatever. And the Vatican II comes along. But
isn't that funny?
So I grew up, going to both churches. It was a while before I discovered that not every kid went to church twice on Christmas and Easter, because we would go like to Catholic Mass in the evening and then get up in the morning and go to the Protestant church service. But like that was a good upbringing for me in a lot of ways, because they're different beliefs. Like my mother transubstantiated her whole life, I think. My dad thought that was silly, right? So I think it's possible. And I think, a number of Indigenous people I have met, I think do it really well, because they're like, I am Diné, I am Meskwaki, I am, Lakota, and I'm American. Right. And they have struggled, as groups to hold on to that heritage. But like,
one of the most powerful speeches or city council just is like the worst environment to talk about these things, as is a school board meeting, as is basically every avenue we have. We just do not have spaces to have dialogue and to know one another and to understand our own humanity and our person across from us. But the woman who was a City of Rock Island employee who was going through all of this at the time of the storm, and the sign had blown down. So the sign never ended up going to Black Hawk Bank, because some leaders of Native tribe, I think, or nation met with the president and kind of opened his eyes a little bit, and he changed his mind. He rejected the donation. Larry Lockwood met with maybe Jim
Hughescamp.
Yeah. So that donation never went through because the bank rejected it. But then the sign blew over in a storm in 2023, I believe. Yeah. And I thought it was so fascinating to hear this city employee talk about her experience, kind of encapsulated it all. Yeah. Because the sign blows down. She's working at the City of Rock Island. She is a Native person, but nobody really knows because she just looks like a white girl, or just a person, she's not wearing a robe and carrying a
that is very confusing to some people. Where they're like, what? Wait, you can't be Indian.
She's not wearing a headdress and carrying a bow and arrow and, all these stereotypical caricatures. So she's just at her workplace as a modern, person. And I don't even know the right term. Do I say Indigenous or Native American? Or
I defer to the people. Okay. And my default is, if I know the tribal nation they belong to, I would try to use the name of their tribal nation. Yeah. I think she was Kickapoo, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So this young Kickapoo woman, and so she's kind of in this environment, and she starts to hear all the things I've heard echoed on the Facebook comments like, well, I never heard anybody complain about this sign when it was up all those years. And so she talked about this unique experience of both being impacted by the messaging and the image and the conversations, but also having this burden of having to prove that you're impacted. So she's working for the city. One council person starts to joke that the council person of that ward is now the chief of the Black Hawk sign. And then that that the gods have blown over the sign. And then the community media person is like, well, my God said, let there be wind. And so there's this weird conversation going on publicly among her colleagues and the people who write her, the city government about the sign that's kind of insensitive, but then also like prove to us that it impacted you, that it's there. But like they're demonstrating the behavior that people who grow up, having to see caricatures and images and, I don't even know what an equivalent would be, but I was like, if you had a well-to-do family in Rock Island and you created an extreme caricature of the patriarch of that family and then stuck him on 11th Street. And maybe really embellished his weight or really embellished his wallet or, and it's like, it would be like, oh, that was such a funny sign growing up. There was that fat man on 11th Street. You could use words that would be harmful to describe a body type or something.
Right.
But to that family, that would feel painful and maybe shameful and a misrepresentation and pigeonholing someone into an identity that wouldn't be accurate. But that was fascinating to me, to watch this young woman be unnoticed in her identity.
Right.
Then have to prove her identity and then have to witness people disparaging her heritage.
And to have to speak up when you're already feeling like people can't see you.
Yeah.
And my experience doesn't even come close to that. But, sometimes as a woman, you might feel a little bit like somebody says something sexist and you're like, should I say something, call attention to that? When they see it as a joke, do I have to tell them why it's not funny to me? And I've gotten better at that now that I'm older and don't care as much about what other people think of me. But yeah, I think one thing that I think all the people, even people who had different ideas about what should happen to the sign, shared, all of the Native people who were testifying, is they want people to know more about them and their history. Right. And so I one of the things that frustrates me is even when the first controversies came up a couple years ago, a couple different people wrote into, I think, the Quad City Times or the Argus or something, on different sides, Native people. And then somebody else wrote a letter to the editor that said something like, well, why can't these Indians agree? What?
I can't agree with my brother on politics, so.
Because they're different people and they have different experiences. And, they're Native people have very different relationships to their history and how they would like to be represented and come out. Obviously there's going to be diversity in their own experiences. And so even like, when I teach this class that's on...
But it's viewing a group as like a monolith. Like,
right.
You are that statue and you're frozen in time and space and your ideology and your personality and is frozen.
And there's... and people tend to, even still today, I think, sometimes say the Black Hawk Indians. There's no Black Hawk Indians. There are no Rock Island Indians.
And he wasn't a chief.
Right. So I think what I, especially as a white person, that frustrates me is because because it's hard to speak, like more of us should know that history so that we can say, I don't get to have that much of a say because I'm not a Native person. But I think I do have an obligation to know more about the history, get to know, where the Meskwaki people are today. I should go to Tama and visit their museum, and I should read about their history and know this beyond just, seeing the sign and saying Black Hawk is cool. Like there are a lot of resources in this area even to learn more about the history. You can go out to Black Hawk State Historic Site. You can go to the museum in Tama. There's there's plenty of, you can read Black Hawk's autobiography and maybe see him
I am going to read
as
that.
a real person, you know.
I saw like this group, it must be like a historical society that does a tour. And like I was like, they had a picture of a driveway in Rock Island where the bones of children were unburied during a reconstruction, and they had to bury them back there. But just the sacred lands and the important spaces for people who were here, and how,
there are many. Yeah, I've done a couple.
Like mounds of burial sites around town.
Yeah, there's interesting. There are mounds in the area, and some of it's on private land, and some of those folks have done a lot to keep people away from it, like because they realize that it is sacred. There was a lot of digging up of bones and stealing of bones in the Quad City area a long time ago. And
and not to put John Hauberg on blast, but he might have been a part of that, maybe.
Yes.
With his Boy Scout troops and going out and looking at, as this person who was interested and curious, but also maybe not always in 18 or 19
early 20th
19th
century,
early 1900s, the most competent or sensitive person.
Yeah.
But also has fought to protect and preserve Black Hawk State Historic, the Singing Bird Lodge. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, he is such a fascinating figure. And like I said, one of the reasons I was attracted to Augustana was because all of his materials, and I've used them extensively. And, one of the ways I think about him is he bothered to get to know Native people and their history. Right. And maybe
in a really imperfect way.
And in a really imperfect way. And I think they were canny enough to, in some cases, use him as a voice. Right. So when he went down to Oklahoma to interview some of Black Hawk's descendants, like they told him things they wanted him to know and didn't tell him other things. Like he wanted to know where Black Hawk's I can't remember if it was his grandson or great grandson who had come to visit. He had met him personally. He had recently died, and he wanted to know where he was buried.
Oh gosh!
And they were like,
"Why?"
Well, we'll show you this other place, right? So they played it pretty close to the vest, but they also communicated with him in ways that did get their story out. My former colleague, Steve Warren, did some research on his relationship with the Meskwaki people, especially in 1916, when he helped to arrange the centennial of Fort Armstrong that was built in 1816. And so he invited a number of Sauk and Meskwaki people, mostly Meskwaki because they were closer, to come back and perform. And, he paid them. And at a time when they really could use payment, right?
I mean, if you think about, like, one of the most ironic things to me about that city council meeting where they just voted unanimously to send the statue away and donate it, the same meeting, there was some controversy because a local like media company had gotten a grant from maybe the national parks or something. Not a huge grant, but to tell the story of African-American history in Rock Island, or Black history in Rock Island. Same meeting.
And hadn't consulted.
And had not consulted. I think there may have been some phone calls and like, we'll get back to you, but not genuinely had a conversation about, should this media company be telling this story without knowledge of the Black community or the story or whatever. So there's this same meeting conversation about how can you not consult a group when you're going to move forward with this action for Black history. But that same city council forgot to get the memo about Native American culture. And so as they're literally having a conversation about that, unanimously vote for this other thing. And so there's something amazing to think that someone in 1916 was like, let me consider other cultures and their place in this story. Because it's 2026 and we still have trouble doing that. So, myself included. I mean.
He is fascinating. And sometimes there's plenty of space for critique of him. But I also feel like, as a white historian myself, like I probably do that's really interesting too. And it's curiosity. You want to know about it. He did he took a lot of white boys to Tama, where they would have encountered Meskwaki people, right? So at least there's that. They did learn dances. Like, so if you ever grew up, I grew up in the 70s when the Boy Scouts, white Boy Scouts would dress up like Native people and dance. But there was some attempt to make.
I dressed up as an Indian for. We would at Eugene Field. We would line the halls with tables, and we'd have cornucopias, and half the school would be a pilgrim. And half the school would be an Indian.
The paper bag, Indian clothes.
Yep, I'd braid my hair. We'd make little paper crowns and put flowers in or feathers in them, and that was our homework. Like, we're making ourselves. So that was normal. Yeah.
There's a great book by Phil Deloria called Playing Indian. He is Native himself. His father, Vine Deloria Jr., is very well known and actually went to seminary at Augustana College. It's just sort of interesting. Phil Deloria was born in Moline, but he wrote this great book called Playing Indian that's all about the many times in U.S. history where white people have taken on the identity of I'll say Indian, right? Because it is sort of an imagined idea of Indianness. So, going back to like the Boston Tea Party, where the people that were dumping the tea in Boston Harbor were dressed as Indians. And people were like, oh, they were trying to disguise them. No, they weren't trying to disguise themselves. They were taking on this persona of Indian to distinguish themselves from British people, right? So even if you look back and at like representations of America early on, even before U.S. becomes independent, like America, the continent, is depicted as an Indian woman, usually, like nude, ready for conquest.
Fertile,
exactly. Right.
Yes.
But a little scary too.
Yeah.
Like a kind of a buff naked woman, like just so the representation, like Europeans and then Euro-Americans have always been sort of using images of Indians in purposeful, fascinating, and problematic ways for a long time. And so, some of Hauberg's work with boys, white boys, immigrant boys in many cases, he's sort of trying to connect them to America in some ways and like teach them these ideas of self-sufficiency, nobility, boldness. But at the same time, it's sort of it's not the full picture of Native history, and so I think that, to me, and I know there's all this controversy about what does history mean, like I just think it's all interesting.
Yeah.
Right? It's not, for me, I won't say it's not about passing judgment, but it's about understanding, like, how did people think? Why did people think that was okay? And,
like, this is such a dorky thing, but you've probably seen Frozen 2.
Oh, yes, I have.
What do you think of that? Because you have this, it is, if you think about Augustana being Swedish and, this kingdom and these young women are Northern European, Swedish. It's really like the Sami people probably like in that representation who they're interacting with. And so she goes into the unknown to like explore, and she's in this deep cave, and then she sees the atrocities of her own grandfather to basically commit genocide against a group of, indigenous people. And so Elsa is reckoning with, but she also has, what they do there then is they make her mother have that ancestry, and then they make her have magic.
And that's why she has the power.
The power. And so they're also playing into these kind of like fantastical or idealized standards of indigenous people, that they are somehow like more spiritual, magical, it's very complex, but
so many of our like white folks' images of Native people are, I think for a long time it was savage, right? I would say between.
Well, my daughter goes to Washington, and it's
Yeah.
the Washington Warriors.
Yeah, and a lot of places had those nicknames. I mean, I would say, the kind of image of Native person as quote unquote savage was
But also
really.
the Swedes have a little bit of that. So we are the Augustana Vikings.
Yeah.
And we are rapists and pillagers.
That's interesting. To go off on a tangent, actually Swedes in the U.S. kind of claimed that identity for themselves in the late 19th century.
We'll roll with it.
Yeah, because as with any immigrant group, not every, but a lot of them coming in the late 19th century tend to be people who need money, right? They're not leaving their homeland because they're rolling in dough, right? They're coming because things are not going well in the homeland. So a lot of the Swedes that came to Chicago were kind of poor.
Oh my gosh, I've seen pictures of my dad's mom's, my great grandma Gandhi, her home she grew up in.
Yeah.
And it was a shack that had 13 kids in it. I mean, they were dying.
Yeah. Yeah, they were
from famine.
Seen as Irish people too. Some of my ancestors, right? Poor, dirty, uncultured. And so one of the ways that the wave of folks that eventually go on to found Augustana kind of claim this old Nordic identity, right? The Swedes as white, right? I mean, not all Swedes were considered to be white.
Keep us separated from those Irish people.
Right.
We're Swedes. And it's funny you say that because my grandpa, my mom's dad, was in the first class at the new Rock Island High School. So he graduated in 1939 from Rocky. Okay. And when he went to college at Augustana, his nickname was the Swede.
Interesting.
And that was his identity.
At Augustana. He could still be the Swede. That's really interesting.
The Swede at Augustana.
Yeah. So there's this, a lot of immigrants groups from different places in Europe have to kind of gain access to whiteness when they get to the U.S.
And then my husband's family was the O'Malleys, probably, I've heard, changed their name to O'Melia.
O'Melia, okay.
Because O'Malley was too Irish and there were too many of them.
Oh, right. Yep.
So we're going to be O'Melia, which is, I've heard that from.
Yeah, I wondered about that because I was like, the O sounds Irish, but the Melia part doesn't, but if it comes from O'Malley. There's a whole, there's another scholar who is Swedish, Gunnlaug Führer, who has done work on immigrants and Indians in the Midwest, and especially with Swedish immigrants. And of course, that's very conflicted too, because the U.S. Dakota War in 1862, which was near Mankato, present-day Mankato, was a conflict between Scandinavian immigrants and Dakota people.
Oh my gosh, what is it called?
I don't know how much you know about that, but there's a very strong local connection to that. So it was 1862, the Civil War is going on. So the Dakota people are supposed to be getting annuities from the U.S. government, and they're not getting them, and they're hungry. And so some of the younger men are very angry, right, and frustrated. Their lives have been really difficult. And so they attack some Swedish settlers who are living nearby and kill them. And that's like we were talking about, just getting along. That's sad too. They knew each other. These groups of people kind of knew each other. So this precipitates basically a war. So the Dakota people kill a number of Swedish immigrants, and then the Dakota people attack Fort Ridgely near present-day Mankato to try to get more food, resources, and weapons. But they're eventually rounded up, marched to Mankato, where I can't remember the initial number of people who were men convicted, a couple hundred. And then I should have checked my numbers on this too, but about 40 of them, I think it's 39, 37 men were hung in Mankato, the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. And it was ordered by Abraham Lincoln. So there's some Native people out there that are yeah. And then the men who were not killed were sent to Davenport. And so if you've ever been to Lindsay Park and near McClellan Heights, so Camp Kearney was there, Fort McClellan. and they were imprisoned there. So if you ever hear people refer online to like the internment camp in Davenport, that's where it was. So there were Native folks were imprisoned there.
And there was a big prison on Arsenal Island for soldiers.
Right.
Of, you know,
and this was separate. So
yeah,
they were on
separate.
like the mainland, and you know, they built a special fortress for them, right? And a number of them died of disease. And interestingly, Andrew Woods Williamson, who taught at Augustana, the one whose parents were missionaries, they were missionaries to the Dakota. And so his father and one of his missionary colleagues actually came to Davenport to mission to the Dakota men who were interned.
Jeez.
And so, and there were a couple women there, Native women. They're like, you should come so you can cook for the men. So, you know, something like 10 women and 100 men. And then their wives, basically their families, were shipped to Kansas eventually. But like, there's this story where they're like, the men are on the, you know, the Iowa side, and they see the boat go by with their families on it. And like, we may never see them again.
Wow.
You know, it's yeah. And so there's a little stone marker in Lindsay Park that says, you know, this is where the Dakota prisoners were held. I was there one time walking my dog. This was years ago, like 15 years ago. And I met a woman who was Dakota, who was there, and we talked for a while, and she's like, yeah, that's where it is. There's a little marker, and maybe we don't want any more than that. They have, and there's a book that was published by a professor at the University of Iowa of letters that the Dakota people wrote to their families, which is like really moving. They have done ceremony there to sort of basically lay the spirits to rest of the people who died there.
Yeah.
Because I did ask once, like, you know, has anybody done anything about this? And I think this happened 10 or 15 years ago, where some Dakota people came and said, like, okay, let's have ceremony.
I feel like I've said this a million times on my podcast, but just our area and Rock Island, Davenport, why don't we have a U.S. history museum here? I mean, probably because it would be millions of dollars and an impossible feat, but I just was so curious. The settlement house that Suzanne Dankman had in Rock Island. Do you know anything about that?
I know a little. You know, I haven't looked at it extensively, and most of what I know has been because students have been, you know, poking around in learning more about settlement houses. And I have a student who's working right now in a class that I'm teaching where we're working with the Rock Island Public Library on some history there. But the Rock Island Public Library had for like a branch in the settlement house. And so she was really interested in learning more about the settlement house. But so the West End settlement started, I think, officially around 1908, 1910. But it had, so there was a woman named Minnie Barker, I think was her name, whom I don't know a lot about. Her husband was a pastor. I do know that. And she started doing work with immigrant and low-income folks in the West End, like to, you know, help them with food, nutrition, clothing, all of the things that people still need, right? Yeah. And so she was doing this work and met Suzanne Dankman Hauberg, who said, the work you're doing is really cool. Can I help to fund it? And I think this was even before she married John Hauberg, so she was still Suzanne Dankman. And so she sort of bankrolled, funded this woman's work, helped to build what became the West End settlement, so that there'd be a place for the workers to work there, who worked there, to live. And I mean, it really wasn't in the model of, you know, of Jane Addams' Hull House. It was not. The in terms of the people living with immigrant people, that's what they wanted for that house to be, is that the workers would live in the house and work with immigrant people. Okay. But it was not in the scale, certainly, of Hull House. They did do classes. And for anyone who's listening,
Hull House was in Chicago. Yes. Jane Addams, and it's kind of the birthplace of social work, and I'm a social worker, so I was interested in
that welfare,
the settlement
social welfare
house
history,
because it was helpful people.
Yep.
trying to help people with hygiene and, home stuff, and but
Yeah.
also kind of this removal of culture, this Americanization, and like, this is how we do things here.
Yep.
And this is how you kind of have to be, and that if you're gonna live here, let us help you be well by being by being more like me.
Yeah.
Let me teach you how to be American like me.
Yes.
And so that has been a critique of that model, is it was, and people were, I assume people who utilized the settlement services, there were some good services there. They were happy to get medication or to have infections cleared, or to, I'm sure some of it was good. It wasn't all worthy of critique, but
and that is the sort of fascinating thing when you look at, and what I know is mostly, so it's kind of coming, what I know about it from like things that get published in the newspaper about it. And so that's coming through a filter in some ways, but they were doing good things. Like they had hundreds of people, like they tallied up the number of people who came, and they had hundreds of people coming for like the Christmas party, because you could get things you needed. The children, they had a children's garden down kind of close to where the Quad City Botanical Center is now. So they started a garden for the kids to learn how to garden and to grow food for their family, so they could sell some of it and take some of it home, sort of like Augie Acres is now, right? So they gave away blankets. Women came and made blankets, so they're, working, and then you can take them home. And so they did give them a lot of things that they needed, but when you read the newspaper reports, there is this overtone of like, the work of the West End settlement is morally elevating to the needy. No, they don't use the word like riffraff, right? But like there's this sort of derogatory.
Yeah, we're kind of civilizing the Irish.
Yes.
At this time it would have been mostly white immigrants,
right,
who would be from poor, or when I interviewed Deb Kunze, she said a lot of the men were, working labor jobs, and then they'd take their money and they'd go get drunk. Yep. So it was like, this is, yeah. So
you could take a shower there. There was a lot of alliance between the prohibitionists and the social workers. So the Haubergs were prohibitionists. And sometimes my students were like, I don't want people to drink. But there was some of the reasons why, especially like middle-class reform-minded women were interested in prohibition, was because men had control of the paycheck.
Yeah. They
would drink when they got their paycheck, and then less was coming home to the families. Yeah. And so that's one reason why they get into this prohibition work. But I think one of the things that's fascinating to me about the settlement houses and the way they talk about the people that are using the services is that they don't know how to do things. Like they don't know how to feed their children. They don't know how to keep their children clean. They don't know how to keep a house clean. And I can't help but, it's not that they don't know how, right? It's they can't.
Well,
and
it's
they don't have the
conditions,
resources.
and it's the irony conditions. Of, I have some good relationships with people who live at Century Woods. You could hear the same arguments being made about people who live there today. Yeah. And it's maybe different populations, and it might not be my husband's great grandmother who lived there, because at some point that became not segregated, and also the government kind of stopped really caring about providing high quality housing to like deserving poor people.
Right, the deserving poor. You have to be a widow,
yes.
right? Whose husband preferably died in World War I. Right?
Yes. Yep. And so all these different things have happened, but it is because I'm just also so interested in that settlement movement. And then when the Great Migration happened and Black families started moving up from the South, how did that change the settlement house? Were those families allowed to use the services, or were they kept out of that? Were they also seen as kind of immigrating from Southern, how did that shift the landscape? Because then we see this flight of immigrants out of the West End over time, and not everyone left.
Yep.
I mean, I think the German teacher from Rock Island, Mrs. Patch, last time I checked, she still lives in the West End. But there's all these dynamics, and when I look at, someone could say, oh, this family living in Century Woods, okay, you used a statement, can't keep their children clean. But it is a for-profit corporation that chooses not to do pest control.
Right.
But if you were at a really fancy apartment complex in Davenport or something, the person who runs that is doing pest control because the people who live there can choose to go live somewhere else.
Yep.
And so there are these other factors at play that we allow as a society certain places to be neglected.
Yeah.
And we allow people to be devalued.
Yep.
And then, you know, they have cockroaches in their house because like anybody would if you're not doing regular.
I've lived in a place with cockroaches for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
mice, or, you
well,
know.
and a lot, it sounds like, and again, it is not, the settlement house is not my area of specialty, but it sounds like women were using the settlement house services because they were working. So like in the early 20th century, they need two incomes, right? Because working class men are not getting paid enough to sustain a family. So they had a daycare. So little kids like 2, 3 could go there because the moms were working too to try to sustain their household. Or, you know, immigration always causes separation from families. So if you're talking about things like childcare or nursing, women are being separated from their mothers and their sisters who would have told them, like, you know, here's how you nurse your baby, and, you know, here's how you can make sure that your child has nutrition. So one of the big services they provided there was milk for infants. And so, you know, you like the public health nurses coming in and saying, you know, we're distributing milk to babies and teaching mothers how to feed their babies. And I'm like, you know, I know people use apps for that now and things like that, but like people, it's not that hard to know when your baby is hungry. But if you might not be able to nurse your child if you're not getting adequate nutrition yourself. And so the picture that emerges is, you know, women who are doing what they can to feed their kids and keep them healthy. And if that means using the services of the settlement house, of course they're going to do it because they're going to try to keep their kids alive.
Well, and I had this interesting thing. Okay, so this like ties all of this together. When SNAP benefits were maybe in limbo and going to get cut, and there was a lot of fear from the people I know that live in Century Woods about like, what's going to happen next week and will I be able to feed my kids? And so I have a friend, Demetrius Johnson, who runs the green store across the street from Century Woods. Yeah. And he always tries to help people out. Like, if you don't have enough, you can borrow, you can pay me back later, or I'll just cover it. So I know that this is happening and all the good stuff he does. So I'm like, you know, I'm just going to get some money and I'm going to take it down there and be like, use this to just cover people. Because you have the relationships, people are coming in here. So I drive to my bank down the street, which is Black Hawk Bank.
Full circle.
I see, you know, the picture of Black Hawk there, and I go get my cash out, and there's this dilemma of people who have no income or food if not for the provision of it through the federal government. And so I drive by, you know, Black Hawk Park because I have to go there to get down to Century Woods, and I'm just thinking about, like, oh, all this land used to be public and shared. And if you needed to feed your family, you could do that because you could find some spot and you could grow some stuff. And now people don't own land, but also can't use land, you know, or the unhoused stuff I've been doing. It's like, there's nowhere for you to be because you don't own land. Yeah. And you haven't proven that you'll be productive on land. And so there's literally nowhere for you to go to lay your head down and sleep. So I'm driving down to give this cash to someone so that people can, you know, feed themselves because they can't grow food anywhere and they can't buy food if the government decides we'll no longer give you or we're going to mess with like whatever benefit you get. And meanwhile, I have my friend Royce running around town being like, there's this empty lot. There's this empty building. You know, we've lost 15,000 people in Rock Island. And we have all these empty and vacant, so many empty places, not only properties, but parcels of land. But now we live in a time where if people were to say, like the settlers did, like, we don't want people in poverty to have a settler's mentality, which is, hey, guess what? That land isn't being used.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take it.
Right. Yeah.
Like, we have people now trapped because back then it was a free-for-all.
Right.
And if you needed to do something, you took and you asserted yourself and you changed the goalpost and you changed the rules and said, make me follow the law. And he was the president. And
John Deere like started on public land, basically, the guy John Deere.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, I mean,
but now we have people who are law abiding.
Yeah.
And so I love Royce's piece because he's not really like necessarily doing anything, but he is highlighting we have all this space and all this land, and it's all privately owned. Yeah. And those private owners are doing nothing with it but let it dilapidate. And people, humans, have no right to do with the land what they would need to take care of themselves.
Yeah.
It's like we flipped it completely upside down, but we would never accept if people in poverty were like, the system isn't working for me, and so I'm just going to move into this empty house and fix it up because it's just been sitting here and claim it as mine.
There's been movements of that in Europe, actually, where people have, like, unhoused people have taken over apartment buildings. And after a while, there's like,
I mean, I don't want to be the leader of that because I don't want to go to jail. But as I was driving down the road, I was just like, this is how what we've done to ourselves through the wild pursuit of, I am a capitalist, I'm an entrepreneur, like I like systems of having a dollar and I like the security that provides, but it's also just wildly hypocritical or ironic that it's like we have people like a Jackson, or someone could say a Trump, I'm going to go to Venezuela, I'm going to change the leadership, and I'm going to take the oil.
Yep. Change the rules in a way that benefits me, but
and is that the culture? Is that a culture? A culture of changing rules to benefit your own prosperity? Because I often think with immigration and, like, let's say something happens where the only safe place to be is near to the equator for environmental reasons. Like, you need to be near the equator to survive. Will Americans respect borders? Will we respect the law?
I don't know.
What is your guess? Would our government say, well, that's the Mexican border and we have to respect these sovereignty and borders? And, do you ever see superpowers being like...
Recent history has suggested that we do not respect borders when it disadvantages us, or when it advantages us to not respect them.
But we put an onus on disenfranchised groups and
to stay in their place.
Stay in their place and respect this treaty that you entered into unlawfully.
Yep.
And then even when you respect it, if it no longer works for a civilization, we will just make you move anyway.
Yeah.
And it's just so fascinating to me because I feel like we just live the same history out again and again.
Yeah.
And how do you reckon with it? I think there's a real push now to just ignore it, to say, don't look at the past. Don't look at the sign that tells you that people lived here. Don't look at the plaque that shows the influence of a culture, because our administration has said, no, we don't want to look at those things.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to keep doing the work, which I think a lot of people do, right? You gotta find a different way to do it.
But we always have to adapt to their standard. Yeah. We stay in place.
Yep.
Even though it's a smaller group, but it's like there's still that mindset of like that group of people gets to do what they want and keep changing the rules. And maybe I'm part of that group. Maybe people would identify me as being a part of that group. And what is my own reckoning? There's so much to talk about, Jane. I could keep going.
Well, yeah, I think there's so much more we could know. And, obviously I think people get this idea that, like, I just think history is interesting. And I think there are so many different perspectives for looking at any event in history. And so like the kind of removal of history that you're talking about, like literally removing plaques that say what actually happened in a place. I just think that's so sad. Right? Because just to know something happened doesn't mean that a person's going to feel a certain way. Like students in my classes, like they want to know what happened, and they might come from different political ideologies, but the most common comment I get in classes where we talk about like basically legalized slavery in Illinois, even in spite of that it was illegal, like it still happened, and students are like, what? How come nobody told me this? And they just want to know, like they want to know what really happened. Or like teaching Native history or women's history even. Like I've had students that say, why didn't anyone ever tell us this about women? Like the idea that anything that bad that happened in history is automatically going to make people feel bad. It doesn't. I think it energizes people sometimes. They're like, well, why did that happen? Like, let's not do that again. Or let's like try to figure out.
Well, to be like a fully integrated, actualized human, you have to look at, they call it your shadow self or the dark side of the moon. You got to look at both.
Yeah.
And I'm not even talking about history. I'm talking about in your own personal, you have to look at what's working for you. What are your strengths? What are the things that you do well? And what are the yucky bits?
Yeah.
And violence is part of all of us. Aggression it's in there for everyone. Wanting your way, all of that is there for every human. But how do maybe different groups over time, how have they allowed or kind of seen that through to like, I want this land. What will I do to get it?
Yeah.
And that could be throughout the world, we're always all contending with this. So I feel like knowing history is like, what people are capable of.
Yes.
And if any human is capable of it, that means that I could be capable of it. My leaders could be capable of it. And what are we trying to like guard for? What have we learned collectively is maybe a better, more peaceful. If my goal would be like peace and unity, and maybe that's not everyone's goal.
Well, but there's great lessons in history about survival, about overcoming adversity, about joy, right? And so when we don't talk about some of these episodes, we're also not talking about those things either. Like, the story of Native American survival is really amazing, and there's all this horribleness, in that history too. But there is, it should be inspirational.
Yeah.
I think. Any history has something inspiring, like even if from whatever perspective you're coming at, like this is a horrible thing that happened. In my class we were just studying the race riots in Chicago in 1919, and it's violent and it's horrible, but the students are like, oh well, it sounds like that really helped to cohere a sense of identity for Black people who had come up through the Great Migration, and that they figured, well, if this is going to happen, then we really need to figure out who we are and stand up for ourselves. And so, there's things that come out of every moment in history that, that I hope we think about at our own turning points and think, well, we could go this way or that way.
It would be cool if Augustana, I feel like it is the type of institution that could host, because I've been doing a little bit of stuff with Rock Island High School, talking to students there. They're grappling with these same themes in their own school. Different populations, different treatment, different expectations, different, they're grappling with it. And I was there this week and I noticed the same thing I notice among adults, that we don't have spaces to dialogue.
Yeah.
We do not. And I wonder if, off the word reckon, if there could be like a reckoning series where you could get, different people to get together and do some intergroup dialogue of how do we know one another, and to really sit with that. Like, you can tell me your experience as a Black woman in this community, or an Indigenous man, or whatever. How do I hear you without all my stuff coming up to be like, well, I didn't do that to you.
Right. No, that wasn't me.
So what do you want me to do about it? Because that's what I feel. This reaction is like, I can't hear you without my own stuff coming up to be like, well, what do you want me to do about it? Is there something for me in the reckoning? Is there some ask of me? Or
maybe
is
we
there...
need to bring back, when was it? Oh, I want to say either right before, maybe even during the pandemic, Dr. Monica Smith, who was our DEI director, and Jason Mon, who's in the religion department at Augie, and some other folks, hosted a series of community discussions. It was called like the Big Table, Round Table.
Oh, I remember.
Do you remember
that?
those? Yeah. And it had that sort of sentiment to it.
Oh,
Like, let's bring
cool.
together people from different areas of our community to just talk. Augie has done that with like students mostly.
Yeah.
Before. There used to be a dinner thing like 10, 12 years ago where people would get together and have dinner together, where they'd try to bring together like some students from BSU and students from, I don't know, some Black Student Union is BSU, I don't know, fraternity or something, like let's have a discussion. So yeah, finding space for that might be a good
goal.
Aftermath for our book, is maybe think about how to bring that back again.
For that specific constellation of figures to have some place to reckon.
Mm-hmm. And community members too, because, one of the things in Dr. Smith's chapter, she talked to Black students who'd gone to Augustana and were part of BSU because they had a 50th anniversary a few years ago. And, there were people who had never been back to the Augustana campus. They had no reason to come back, because it never really felt like home to them. Like it was a place to get an education, but they hadn't come back. And so you think, well, you have this whole group of people, like you said, your family came here and kind of stayed because of Augustana, and then we have other people who got educated there, but like it didn't stick, right, in terms of cultivating. And that, I don't think that's on the graduate, right, that there should be something more that an institution can do to kind of keep those connections going.
Well, we have Augustana. I mean, it's such an anchor and pillar and strong point for Rock Island. Like, we'd be sort of lost. It's one of the institutions we'd be lost without. But I love that this book signals to me that Augustana leans into its position as bringing people together globally and immigrants, and I love that is a focus or something, because I feel like Rock Island, as people are coming here now, you came here 20 years ago, my vision, which isn't everyone's, but is we would be the most global city of the Quad Cities, and that we would find a way to let that identity unlock economic opportunity, social opportunity. That's like, if you want a global experience, if you want diversity, so we kind of do that now, in that our figures will say, oh, we're more diverse, but we're doing it in this way of proximity, but not fellowship, where it's like, yes, statistically that's true. Like, we're all here, but we have not unlocked the like full embrace of that and embracing the economic potential of all people. We're still kind of like, who's the Davenport character? And even as a woman business owner who's like a diehard I don't feel in this city that I've been able to work in the economic space in a way that, I don't know, I've gone for different grants and tried to get like funding to help me expand my space. And it's been like, no, you're not really, your business doesn't qualify, or you're not a fit. And it's like, really? I don't know. Yeah. So that's my hope, is like we could be, if you want to live in a progressive, where one day Rock Island will be, not just proximity, but fellowship, and you can feel safe and have equitable opportunity and like integration, but not in a forced way, but in a way of like, this feels good for everyone involved. Right. Not gentrification, not, anyway, Jane, that's my dream. For everybody.
It's a good dream. A noble dream.
Yes. Yeah. Never give up on your stupid dreams.
Well, there was a time many, many years ago when people thought that maybe Rock Island would be like a capital of Illinois, because it was at a confluence of rivers, and this was kind of before Chicago started to grow, and people are like, oh, that's silly. How could that be? Like, well, it makes some sense. And Chicago started small.
Yeah.
And it's an extremely diverse place, even, and it does, like we were saying earlier, is it possible to have a kind of ethnic or a cultural identity and be next to each other? And I think they can. Like, there's certainly places in the world now where that happens, even within a few city blocks. Last summer we went to Toronto, and it's got like all the Thai restaurants are in one place, and all the Nepalese restaurants are in one place. And you can tell that the people living around them are Thai or Nepalese, but they're like literally 2 blocks away from each other. And so it, you know, in a moment, like they're clearly defined. This is where you go to get this kind of food and hear this language, but then you walk 2 blocks and you're in a different place. And obviously everybody's all walking around and people speaking English and speaking French, and not like, you know, Toronto is an ideal city either, but you get the sense that like, oh, there can be differences and people can cohabit and you can share each other's food.
But this administration is just so feels that is impossible and bad for America. And the vice president was literally saying, well, no, it's not unreasonable for an American not to want 20 foreigners to move in next door who don't speak the language, like almost like making that message of, I don't know, it's so I guess I just want for Rock Island to be like the antithesis of that it's so much more fun and fulfilling and to be in a global city and to not fear so much.
Learning about other people is so interesting. You know, when I was a kid, we used to have international students come through our house all the time because we lived in a university town. And so, you know, we were always like hosting, or my dad would have students come to dinner, and like, it was interesting. Like, why wouldn't you want to learn? And, you know, I'm sure we ask stupid questions.
I feel like curiosity is such a superpower.
Yeah.
You know, as a therapist, as a human, I don't believe in cultural competency. I always hated that term because it's like, no, you can't go to a training and be like, oh, I'm now competent on your culture. But if you are curious about other people within the same culture, a different culture, it's just, that is such a bridge to connection.
And you have to let down your own, I mean, you can't, students worry sometimes, and I do too, like a lot of us do, even if you're curious about other people, like, oh, what if I ask a stupid question? You're gonna ask a stupid question. Right? And you're maybe gonna feel stupid, and maybe you are stupid. I don't know. Like, that you have to be willing to say, like, I don't know everything. And like, if you offend somebody, say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't realize my question was offensive. It came from a place of curiosity. Can we talk about it more?
Like, if someone labeled me as woke, you know, they'd probably not be like too far off the mark. Like, I'm okay if you want to label me that. But one downside of woke culture or whatever happened there was a little bit of a fear
of offense,
saying the wrong thing, offending someone. And so that can really close people down, and it can actually disrupt connection. So you know, we all want to be respectful while we're being curious, but I would rather mess up and have someone actually get mad at me and then reckon with or wrestle through a rupture to be like, you know, what you just said was really freaking offensive. And I don't want to get canceled, but I want to be able to be like, oh shit, tell me, you know.
tell me. I don't want to make that mistake twice. Yeah, and I think I
mean, even the Black Hawk sign, to be like, oh, I like that sign. You know, that was kind of an initial, I'm not going to hate myself because that was my initial. No, and I don't, no one's going to beat me up, but I'm going to stay in the conversation and be curious about what I might be getting wrong. What other perspectives are. And it doesn't mean I have to like completely change my mind or turn into a different person, but it's like, how do I onboard new information? How do I be curious about my little, you know, I'm a little atom in space dinging off other atoms. How do I be curious about that? And maybe that can loosen up, like, I don't have to be like afraid to.
We should all be less fearful of lots of, I think people don't have conversations sometimes because, especially if we're on the liberal end, like, I don't want to offend anybody, so I'm not even going to ask the question. Right. And I feel that myself. Like, I don't want to bother people to ask them questions. So, I mean, that's one reason I feel like it's better to get informed a little bit first, so that when you come to somebody and ask questions, then you show that you've at least showed some interest in them as people or a culture, and then you want to know more.
Like, if someone invited you to play tennis and you've never heard of it, you might Google it before you go and get a basic sense of.
It's funny you bring that up because my son plays tennis and I don't know the rules at all, and I can't figure out the scoring, and I am mocked within my family. I like to watch him play. I have played tennis. I have no idea how to score tennis.
Well, wrestling. My daughter just joined wrestling. I had no idea about it, so I had to inform myself a little bit so that I can be there and watch and not be completely clueless.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's just the respect of like, someone's invited me into something. How much of their time do I want to waste being like, what just happened?
Yeah.
What, you know?
Yes, I saw there's the Glennon Doyle book over there, and I never understood offsides, and she's got that
Yes.
funny one where she's like, our offsides, ours is not to know.
Yeah.
Because I never know offsides.
And
but I'm always like, yay, team.
Yeah, Glennon's an interesting character because she, you know, a lot of people will criticize her, critique her, be irritated by her, but I'm always like, you know what? You are out there having conversations, you are being curious, you are engaged in the world around you, and that's hard. And so, you know, step your foot in it. Put your foot in your mouth and then work through it.
And as podcasters and teachers, we have
do
done
that every day.
Right?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
here.
This was a lot of fun.
So fun.
It's good to reconnect.
I think I could talk to you for 17 hours.
We'll have to hang out sometime
Yes,
again.
exactly.
Like podcast or no, but yeah,
Yeah.
it was really great to talk, and I've been, you know, watching your space for a while now, so it's fun to get to talk again.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yay, we did it.
I will run off to my office hours.
Huge thank you to Jane Simonsen for joining me today on Rock Island Line. You should check out Call to Reckon. And I'm going to link some of the books she recommended, like the autobiography of Black Hawk, in the show notes. If you like what I'm doing here at Rock Island Line, you can hop on over to www.rockislandline.com to read articles, submit your think tank ideas about Rock Island, and reach out to me. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time on Rock Island Line.